Hello there, you're watching the press preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. So it's time to see what's making the headlines with Sonia Sodha, the chief leader writer at The Observer, and Christopher Hope, associate editor for politics at the Daily Telegraph. So a very good evening to both of you. Very pleased to say that you're going to be with me here until just before midnight. So let's take a look then at what's making the front pages. And ashes of a dead land. The Guardian leads with the words of Ukrainian officials who accuse Putin's forces of indiscriminate fire on civilians in Mariupol as a mass exodus of the city intensifies. Ukrainians regain key territory, forcing the Russian army to retreat in several locations, but raising fears that Putin may soon turn to chemical weapons. That's what's on the front of the Daily Telegraph. Exiled Ukrainian protesters on board a dinghy and holding flags marked "No War" have tried to block Abramovich's super yacht from entering a port in Turkey. That's according to the Metro. The Financial Times says the Chancellor Rishi Sunak is planning to set aside a large part of an unexpected £20 billion boost to the public finances this year, rather than helping families hit by the cost of living crisis. The Daily Mail, though, focuses its attention on calls for the Chancellor Rishi Sunak to axe what's been branded the worst-timed tax rise in history. Well, the Star leads with a story about what they say is discrimination against people with Cockney accents. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code that you can see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's papers while you watch us. And so, Sonia Sodha and Christopher Hope with me to go through some of those front pages. And Sonia, we're picking up with a few of the front pages are still leading on the situation in Ukraine, The Guardian being one of them. You've picked this out first of all, and the grim headline, "Ashes of a Dead Land, Russia lays waste to Ukrainian port." And this is the ongoing bombardment of Mariupol in the south of Ukraine.
That's right. So it's a Guardian report from Lviv, which is a city in the west of Ukraine that sort of is relatively safe compared to the rest of the country and is acting as a route for refuge for people looking to leave the country. But lots of the Ukrainian refugees who've been arriving there, hoping to get out of the country to safety, have been coming from Mariupol. And so this is a report of first-person accounts of what it's been like to live in Mariupol over the last few days. And I have to say, I mean, it's described like hell on earth. So there are families who've talked to my colleague who's written this report, who describe what it's like to have lived in a basement for days on end while there's been shelling going on, surviving on a few scraps of food between you, dirty water. This family that was interviewed, they feel very lucky to have made it out alive. They say it was sort of chance that they managed to get out. Someone sort of said that they knew a way out. And I think it just speaks to how dreadful, the tactics that the Russians are using. They're very, very similar to tactics that they used in Syria when they intervened in Syria. It's besieging a city like Mariupol. It is subjecting it to constant bombardment. It's targeting civilian targets like kindergartens, like hospitals, like psychiatric hospitals. We know that this has happened. And this is really, it's a campaign of terror to try and get citizens to surrender.
Well, yeah, and Christopher, those details just are horrendous. And if we turn to the Daily Telegraph, it's when you read a slightly more optimistic headline, it almost jars, doesn't it? In contrast to those, witnesses' accounts of what they're going through, because the Daily Telegraph's main headline is "Ukrainians regain key territory in fight back," and that chimes with what President Zelensky himself said today. He talked about being on the brink of survival.
That's right. And of course, there is the fog of war, which you must never forget. That amazing piece by Daniel Buffy about rotting corpses in the street of Mariupol is what's on the ground. Now, you step back, helicopter view of Ukraine. It's not going so well for Vladimir Putin. We're approaching the 1-month anniversary of the war breaking out, the invasion, I should say, of Ukraine happening by Russian forces. And look what's happening. It looks like the Russians are retreating in several areas, despite fears that Putin may turn to chemical weapons, we say in our headline. That's been mooted for a few days now. Hasn't happened yet, and thank goodness. But we report here how we're quoting the Ukrainian Defense Ministry that its forces retook Marikiv, a town west of Kiev, despite a fierce battle there. And that's why it's so important. I mean, it has not happened in the way they thought. This special military operation, which Putin is trying to convince Russians was a good thing. Well, it's not happening. There are lots of people dying. Lots of Russians are dying. At some point, he'll get his reckoning for this, just not just yet. But this is positive if you take what Ukraine is saying for what's happening.
Well, yes, absolutely. Let's move on to look ahead to tomorrow now, because a lot of the papers do lead with the Chancellor Rishi Sunak's options ahead of his spring statement tomorrow. The Financial Times is the paper that you've picked out first of all, which, as you might expect, makes this their front page story. They're suggesting that a boost to the public finances that has come about is going to be saved by Rishi Sunak rather than spent, aren't they, Sonia?
Yes, that's right. So there's £20 billion extra in the coffers, more headroom than was predicted this time a year ago. And the Financial Times is saying that he might spend some of that on alleviating the pain for households facing a cost of living crisis, huge increases in energy bills, housing costs, etc. But that he's going to save most of it, one would assume, to spend closer to election time. I think this would be the wrong thing to do. There's lots of demands on this pot of money, so lots of people are calling for him to scrap the national insurance rise. I actually think that's the wrong thing for him to do, because the national insurance rise, if you scrap that, it costs £9 billion. More than half of that goes to the richest fifth of households. So it's not a very good way of spending your money wisely to protect the lowest income households, of people in the low paid jobs who are really on the brink. I mean, what they're facing is really terrible. So what other think tanks have called for is for the Chancellor instead to spend that money on increasing tax credits for low-income households, because at the moment those levels are going down in real terms because of the rising cost of inflation.
Well, let's deal with national insurance and what you think of that, Christopher, because it does actually feature on the front page of the Daily Mail. They're saying you can spike the hike, Rishi, and that's going to chime with quite a few backbenchers, actually, who think that it's the wrong time to introduce a rise in national insurance. What do you think? Do you think introduce it but then mitigate against it for the poorest, or do you think not introduce it? What's your take on it?
He's on the hook here, isn't he? The problem is if he delays it by a year, he saves £12 billion. Great. The problem is he then puts the national insurance rise, which has to happen, we're told, to pay for NHS for 3 years and then after that social care, right on the eve of a 12-month countdown to the May 2024 general election. So what do? More likely, I think, he's going to fiddle with the thresholds, so it will take those on the lowest wages out of national insurance in the same way they're out of it if they pay income tax. The government set aside Thursday for a big day in Parliament, a 3-line whip, to use the language I talk in, and that means lots of MPs have been called back for some big voting. Something big will happen on Thursday. People I speak to think he'll play with these thresholds on national insurance. It's interesting, though, isn't it, what Sonia's saying there? It does show there'll be a big debate here between the Tories and the Labour. The Tories will be trying to say, we want to put money away for a rainy day. His brief remarks from the Treasury overnight talk about increased security of a faster growing economy, the security of a more resilient public finances. And that's what the government's saying. And Sonia's right too, of course, building up a war chest for tax cuts going to the next general election. And that's what the budget next year is about. The pain now, and then the good stuff later on.
Well, yes, and Sonia, you were saying that you think that the money should be spent now, but I suppose the other argument, again, is looking at how much had to be spent on the pandemic. I mean, billions. I mean, can the Chancellor afford to carry on borrowing and keeping on spending?
Well, there is this extra money, that's extra headroom, and I do think that he needs to do something for households, for people in low-paid work, they're in minimum wage jobs. That means you're struggling and you're having to make really difficult choices at the moment, some of them, between, can I afford to switch the heating on, or am I going to put food on the table? These are, we've got lots of families using food banks, making very, very difficult decisions. So I think the Chancellor's I doubt he will, but I think he really should be focusing on those households. And the alleviation that we've seen him give already around energy bills through the council tax rebate, through this, this sort of loan that households will pay back. That actually, the council tax rebate, £150 a year, that goes to 4/5 of households. So it goes to, everyone's finding it tough, I know, but it's spread that support very thinly when it's really families and minimum wage jobs who really need the most support. So I doubt he's going to do it, because he doesn't tend to make these calls. He doesn't tend to direct support to the very hardest up. But I think that's absolutely what he should be doing, because when you look at energy bills, the average energy bill, it's crazy how much it's going up. And if your energy bill goes up by £400, £500 a year, when you're on a minimum wage job, you just don't have that kind of leeway in your budget.
Well, yes, and we just saw the Guardian's take on it, Chancellor, to stand by hard-working families, Christopher. But it's not just that your energy bill, it's that the cost that puts on your food, everything that's transported around the country, it's all going to be hugely more expensive. And the Bank of England saying that inflation could go into double figures by the end of the year. Is the Chancellor going to do enough so that people can cope?
Well, it's really, really hard. Outside of Westminster, people are looking at the prices on their petrol stations changing. I've heard of them changing 3 times in one day. £1.70 for a litre of unleaded, 50 quid to fill a Fiat 500. This is a lot of money for ordinary people to deal, or anybody to deal with, frankly, not anyone to deal with, frankly. And the Guardian is giving the Chancellor the benefit of the doubt in that headline that you quote there, to stand by hard-working families. He's promising security for them. They'll be hoping there'll be some targeted help, and that's why I think this threshold idea has a lot of mileage right now in Westminster. But there might be a rabbit. Certainly, we haven't even talked about defence, by the way, yet. Now, I think that the issue of defence, whether that should go up from 2% of GDP to 3 or 4%, that is the next big debate. But we're told that might happen in the budget in November. And by then, well, who knows what's Putin up to by then? It may require urgent funding before that.
Certainly, lots of very difficult decisions for the Chancellor to make. It'll be fascinating to see which way he lands tomorrow. We're going to take a break right now. Lots more to talk about in just a moment, including could there be a U-turn on onshore wind developments to ease the UK's energy woes? We'll talk about that in just a moment. With me tonight, Sonia Sodha, the chief leader writer at The Observer, and Christopher Hope, chief political correspondent at the Daily Telegraph. And Christopher, we're turning back to the front page of the Daily Telegraph now, your paper. And their second story there is about a push for onshore wind farms. This in the light, of course, of Britain trying to wean itself off Russian oil and gas. So what's the paper saying?
Well, this is like a retread of the battles in the Cameron years, when there was a big push on green energy, and then David Cameron kind of gave up in 2013-14 in the face of an assault from UKIP over Europe. But at that point, it was all about new onshore wind farms, and the policy became offshore wind farms. And that's why you see these array of windmills all around the British Isles. And this new idea, because of the soaring cost of energy, is to change planning rules, making it easier to site onshore wind farms near communities. This will be a red rag to a lot of readers of the Telegraph and people who live in rural areas who just don't want to see them on their on hillsides and near them, and they will not be happy about it. And that's why we're reporting tomorrow's paper a cabinet split over this idea to tear up planning rules. Apparently, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, of course, up tomorrow in front of the Commons for the spring statement, spoke in favour in a parliamentary debate last year of controls on wind farms. So he's quite an opponent, and not surprisingly, he lives in Richmond in North Yorkshire. So lots of areas concerned, and I think this shows how the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has changed all assumptions. And so really old ideas which were rejected in peacetime, no longer.
Well, yes, and we still got to get the outline, haven't we, of what the government plans to do about its energy provision, given what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. Let's move on, though, Sonia. On the front page of the FT, they cover P&O's latest steps after sacking loads of their staff.
That's right. So this is just a little story on the front of the TFT about the amount of compensation that P&O is making available. But there's been other sort of news emerging today as well. So, P&O have sacked 800 workers, behaved really abominably, I think, with no notice. And apparently, according to unions, they're employing seafarers from other places for as little as £1.80 a week. So that £170,000 figure, I mean, that's only for a very small proportion of the SAT workers who've got very, very long periods of service. But government ministers have actually said today they've warned P&O it may face the threat of prosecution because it has not played by the rules on this at all. It didn't give ministers the warning that they're supposed to give when they're making more than 100 British workers redundant. So really, really terrible behaviour by P&O.
Well, yes, and just to say, I think you said £1.80 a week. I mean, it's £1.80 an hour, which is still not very much. Being paid to those replacement workers, just to be clear there. I think we're out of time. I think I'm being told. Are we out of time?
Oh.
We've got 30 seconds. Can you do 30 seconds on civil servants wanting to do the school run? Christopher, go.
I'll be really quick. A union is saying that civil servants should be allowed to work around their life events and things like the school run. So work from home and go and pick the kids up. I mean, for a lot of people in the private sector, that's quite difficult to understand because many of us, rightly, are back at work or have to be back at work.
Okay.
It seems unfair to some people, but why not if you can get away with it in the civil service?
OK, you did brilliantly there with my time constraints. Thank you both. I'll see you again at 11.